The cold seeped through the cracked window pane, a damp, biting cold that smelled of city grit and exhaust fumes. Leo pulled the thin, frayed blanket higher over his daughter's small body, listening to the sound that had become the soundtrack to his nightmares, Mia's breathing. It wasn't the peaceful rhythm of a sleeping child. It was a shallow, wheezing whistle, a tiny, desperate fight for every ounce of air. He felt his own chest tighten in sympathy, a familiar knot of panic coiling in his gut. The last of her inhaler was used 2 days ago. He had tried to make it last, but the relentless damp in the tiny apartment was a constant trigger for her asthma. He looked around the room, at the peeling paint on the walls that looked like shedding skin, the single bare bulb casting long, distorted shadows. His body ached with a fatigue that went bone deep. His hands, once skilled and strong, now felt useless. The grease was still permanently etched under his nails, a ghostly reminder of a job and a life that no longer existed. A year. It had been exactly 1 year since he'd last seen his wife, Clara, and every day since had been a slow, agonizing slide into this abyss. The pink slip of paper stuck to the refrigerator with a cheap magnet was a constant, screaming accusation. Final notice, it read in stark, unforgiving letters. He didn't need to read the rest. The words were burned into his memory. 14 days until they were out on the street. He opened the fridge door out of a desperate, foolish habit, and the weak light illuminated the depressing reality inside. Half a carton of milk, a wilting piece of lettuce, and a single, lonely egg. His stomach clenched with a familiar, gnawing hunger, but the nausea of failure was stronger. He walked over to the rickety kitchen table and pulled out the small, worn leather wallet. He emptied its contents carefully, as if the ritual itself might somehow change the outcome. A crumpled $10 bill, a 5A, and a handful of ones. He counted it 3 times. With the few coins from a jar, the grand total was $200. $200 to his name. $200 to stand between his asthmatic daughter and the cold, indifferent streets. He felt a bitter, hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat, but he choked it down. The sound might wake Mia. The silence was safer. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, a constant presence in the small apartment that used to be filled with Clara's laughter and the sound of her humming as she worked on her mysterious articles. A year ago today, she had walked out the door with a kiss and a promise to be back for dinner. She never returned. The police called it a voluntary disappearance, but Leo knew Clara. She wouldn't leave, not him, and never Mia. He had spent everything, every last cent of their savings, on private investigators, on flyers, on traveling to follow up on bogus sightings. He had drained their future searching for a ghost, clinging to a hope that had slowly, cruelly, been ground into dust. Now, the grief was a raw, open wound, but it was tangled with something worse, the torment of not knowing. He would catch himself staring at her photograph on the mantelpiece, her bright, intelligent eyes, the determined set of her jaw, and the question would tear through him again and again. What happened to you, Clara? Where did you go? The weight of that unanswered question was a physical burden, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He felt a wave of dizziness and leaned his hands on the table. The worn wood cool against his palms. The layoff from the auto shop had been the final blow. "Sorry, Leo," his boss had said, his eyes full of a pity that felt like acid. "Business is slow, and with all the time you've taken off." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Leo had become unreliable, a ghost haunting the garage, his mind always somewhere else, lost in the labyrinth of his wife's disappearance. Now, his expert knowledge of engines and transmissions was worthless. He looked over at Mia again, her small face so peaceful in sleep, blissfully unaware of the cliff edge they were teetering on. He felt a surge of fierce, desperate love that was almost painful. He was her only shield, her only protector, and he was failing. He was failing her in every conceivable way. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as he imagined her small, wheezing body struggling for air in a homeless shelter, surrounded by the coughing and sickness of strangers. The image was so vivid, so terrifying, that he had to physically shake his head to dispel it. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold, grimy glass. the condensation instantly clouding his view of the streetlights below. The city glittered with a life that felt a million miles away, a different universe he no longer had access to. He was 38 years old, and he felt ancient, hollowed out by grief and fear. He had lost his wife, his savings, his job, and now he was about to lose his home. He had hit the absolute bottom, and the terrifying part was that he couldn't see a single handhold, not a single crack in the smooth, dark rock face of his despair. There was nothing left. No one to call, no secret stash of money, just him, his daughter, $200, and the echoing silence left behind by a woman who had vanished into thin air. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. It felt like the only real thing in a world that had become an unrelenting nightmare. His heart didn't just ache, it felt like a cold, heavy stone in his chest, and he had no idea how he would ever find the strength to carry it through another day. Just as the last of his will to fight seemed to drain away, a strange object appeared in the day's mail, wedged between a final bill from a collection agency and a grocery store flyer. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope made of thick, expensive paper. It felt utterly alien amidst the usual detritus of his failing life. His name and address were typed in a severe, official-looking font. There was no return address, only a postmark from a town he'd never heard of, Serra Fria. He felt a tremor of something he couldn't name, not hope, but a sharp, unnerving curiosity. He ran his thumb over the embossed seal on the back, a complex design of gears and keys, before sliding his finger under the flap. The paper inside was just as heavy, and the scent of old archives and dry ink wafted out, a smell from a world of order and permanence that was the complete opposite of his own chaotic existence. He felt his heart beat a little faster, a nervous, frantic rhythm against his ribs as he unfolded the single, densely typed page. The words were a thicket of legal jargon, a language designed to confuse and intimidate. He had to read each sentence 3 or 4 times, his exhausted mind struggling to catch up. Last will and testament, deceased, next of kin, and then a name, Artur Rossi, his great-uncle, a man he didn't even know existed. The letter stated that Artur, a lifelong bachelor with no other living relatives, had passed away, and in a final, inexplicable act, had named Leo as the sole heir to his estate. The word estate conjured images of mansions and sprawling lawns, a fantasy so absurd it was almost laughable. But the letter was specific. The inheritance wasn't a fortune, it was a property. An old commercial locksmith and metalworking shop, located in the remote, forgotten town of Serra Fria. He read the address again. It felt like a name from a ghost story, not a place of salvation. A cold wave of disbelief washed over him, so strong it was almost an physical sensation, leaving him dizzy and uncertain if he was dreaming. There was no real decision to be made. It was this, or the street, this ghost of a chance from a ghost of a relative, or the absolute certainty of a homeless shelter. He felt a bitter irony in the situation. His life had been reduced to a choice between 2 different kinds of ruin. He took down Clara's photograph from the mantelpiece, the glass cool against his fingertips. Her smile felt like a judgment now, a reminder of the life they were supposed to have. He wrapped it carefully in one of Mia's old sweaters and placed it at the bottom of their largest suitcase. He packed what little they owned, a few changes of clothes, Mia's favorite worn teddy bear, and the small collection of his mechanics tools that he couldn't bear to part with. They were a useless weight now, but they were a connection to the man he used to be. Each item he packed felt like a final surrender. The sound of the zipper closing on the overstuffed suitcase echoed in the empty apartment like a gunshot, signaling the end of a chapter, the end of a life he had once known. The bus station was a vortex of noise and hurried motion, a place of jarring indifference. The air was thick with the acrid smell of diesel exhaust and the stale, greasy scent of fast food. Leo held Mia's small hand tightly, his knuckles white. She looked so small and fragile amidst the chaos, her wide eyes taking in the sea of strangers rushing past. He felt a fierce, protective instinct flare up inside him, a desperate need to shield her from the harshness of the world he was dragging her into. He bought 2 one-way tickets to Serra Fria, the transaction pushing his remaining $200 to the brink of extinction. The woman behind the glass didn't even look at him, her face a mask of bored resignation. To her, he was just another transaction, another anonymous soul on the move. He led Mia to a hard plastic bench, the suitcase a heavy anchor between them. They sat in silence, watching the departure board flick through names of distant, hopeful-sounding cities that were not their destination. The journey was a long, rattling ordeal. The bus groaned and wheezed its way out of the city, leaving the familiar skyline of grey concrete and false promises behind. Leo stared out the window, watching his old life recede until it was nothing more than a smudge on the horizon. Mia, exhausted by the stress and the poor air quality of the station, quickly fell into a fitful sleep, her head resting on his lap. He listened to her breathing, that shallow, wheezing sound that was a constant, sharp reminder of their precarity. Each cough, each slight struggle for breath, sent a fresh wave of panic through him. He gently adjusted the thin blanket around her, his hand lingering on her forehead, feeling for the fever that so often followed these bouts of asthma. The steady, monotonous vibration of the bus was supposed to be soothing, but to Leo, it felt like a relentless march towards an unknown and possibly terrible fate. He felt trapped, a prisoner in this moving metal box, hurtling through the darkness toward a place he had never been. As hours bled into one another, the landscape outside the grimy window began to transform. The dense urban sprawl gave way to sprawling, anonymous suburbs, which in turn dissolved into flat, featureless farmland. Then, the land began to rise. The road grew steeper, winding its way into the foothills of a mountain range that loomed in the distance like a row of jagged teeth against the grey sky. The name of the town, Serra Fria, began to make a chilling sort of sense. The air inside the bus, despite the malfunctioning heater, seemed to grow colder, sharper. The few remaining passengers were quiet, weathered-looking people who seemed to carry the same stony silence of the mountains themselves. Leo felt a profound sense of isolation begin to settle over him, heavier and more suffocating than the city smog he had left behind. He was leaving the world he knew, not for a better one, but for a place that felt increasingly like the edge of the map, a place where people didn't go, but from which they disappeared. The bus shuddered to a halt in what could barely be called a town square. A single, flickering street lamp cast a weak, yellow puddle of light on a cracked concrete plaza, empty except for a few wind-blown leaves. "Serra Fria," the driver grunted, not bothering to look back. The hydraulic hiss of the door opening was the only sound. Leo gently shook Mia awake as he wrestled their suitcase from the overhead rack. They were the only ones getting off. As they stepped out, the cold hit them like a physical blow. It was a deep, damp cold that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the place. The bus pulled away with a mournful sigh of air brakes, its red taillights shrinking into the darkness, leaving them utterly alone. The silence that descended was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all other sensations. The town was a collection of dark shapes with shuttered windows and peeling paint, looking like a forgotten film set for a horror movie. A deep dread, cold and sharp, pierced through Leo's exhaustion. He checked the address on the crumpled letter, then looked at a faded street sign. It was a 10-minute walk, according to the bus driver, 10 minutes that stretched into an eternity. He half-dragged, half-carried the heavy suitcase, its one good wheel clattering loudly over the broken pavement, the sound an unwelcome intrusion in the profound quiet. Mia, still groggy from sleep, clung to his leg, her small coughs echoing in the still night air. Every building they passed was dark and seemingly abandoned. The wind, which had been a constant presence, now seemed to gain strength, funneling down the narrow streets with a mournful howl. It whispered through broken fences and rattled loose signs, making the hair on Leo's arms stand on end. He felt exposed, watched by the empty, black windows of the silent houses. This wasn't just a struggling town, it was a ghost town, a place that felt like it was actively dying, and he had just willingly walked into its morgue, his daughter in tow. The fragile ember of hope he'd nurtured was being systematically extinguished, and then he saw it. At the very edge of town, where the paved road crumbled into a dirt track, stood the property, his inheritance. Leo's heart didn't just sink, it plummeted into a cold, dark abyss. The solicitor's letter had called it a commercial locksmith and metalworking shop. The reality was a skeletal, rust-eaten carcass of a building. It was a large, barn-like structure made of corrugated iron, but vast sections were stained a deep, angry orange with rust, while others were missing entirely, leaving jagged, dark wounds. It sagged in the middle, its spine clearly broken. The sign, or what was left of it, hung at a drunken angle from a single hinge, the letters long since scoured away by time and neglect. This wasn't a fixer-upper, this wasn't a project. This was a ruin, a monument to failure and decay. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. This was the hope he had clung to. This was the new beginning he had promised his daughter. He had failed again, more spectacularly than he could have ever imagined. He pushed on the large, groaning metal door, and it scraped open just enough for them to slip inside. The smell hit him first, an overpowering assault on the senses. It was a thick, complex stench of damp earth, pervasive mold, and the metallic tang of old rust. Underneath it all was another, more sinister smell, the musty, cloying odor of decay and long unbothered vermin. He fumbled for a light switch, but his hand met only a cold, damp wall and a tangle of dead wires. The only light came from the moon, filtering through the numerous gaping holes in the roof, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the dirt floor below. It was colder inside than it had been outside, the metal walls seeming to collect and amplify the chill. He could see the faint outline of heavy, silent machinery, hulking shapes shrouded in cobwebs and years of dust, like ancient, forgotten gods in a derelict temple. This place wasn't just abandoned, it felt malevolent, as if it actively resented their intrusion. The wind was a constant, living presence inside the workshop. It wasn't just a draft, it was a symphony of unsettling sounds. A low, mournful moan came from the main structure, the sound of a great beast in its death throes. A higher-pitched, eerie whistle sliced through the air, originating from a dozen broken window panes and cracks in the walls. He heard the drip, drip, drip of water from the compromised roof, each drop landing with a hollow echo that seemed to measure out the seconds of their new, miserable reality. Then, a different sound, a dry, frantic scuttling in the shadows, the sound of things unseen. Mia whimpered and pressed her face into his leg, her small body trembling. He put his arms around her, trying to project a calm he was nowhere near feeling. His own heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the workshop's ghostly orchestra. This wasn't a shelter, it was a trap, and the sound of the wind felt like the whispers of the ghosts who had been caught here before him. He could see the sky through the roof, not just a few holes, but vast, yawning chasms in the corrugated iron. Moonlight streamed through, illuminating clouds of dust motes dancing in the frigid air. The floor was a treacherous landscape of packed dirt, broken concrete, and a sea of discarded metal parts, gears, springs, and unidentifiable chunks of rusted machinery. In one corner, a pile of rotten pallets was slowly collapsing into a mulch of damp wood and fungus. In another, a workbench lay overturned, its contents spilled across the floor like the entrails of some mechanical animal. Everything was covered in a thick grey blanket of dust and grime, a testament to years, perhaps decades, of total neglect. He could feel the dampness of the ground seeping up through the thin soles of his shoes. He had thought the apartment was bad, but it had been a palace compared to this. This was not a home. It was a tomb, cold and dark and utterly devoid of life or hope. He touched a support beam, and his hand came back slick with cold condensation and a film of rust-colored grime. The cold was a physical entity in this place. It didn't just surround them, it penetrated them, seeping into their clothes, their muscles, their very bones. He could feel the damp air clinging to his skin, making his thin jacket feel useless. He looked at Mia, her breath pluming in the air, her face pale in the dim moonlight. She was shivering uncontrollably now, a series of violent, body-racking tremors. He felt the panic that had been simmering within him finally boil over into a cold, hard terror. He had brought his asthmatic daughter from a damp apartment into a freezing, wet, open-air barn. He wasn't just failing her, he was actively harming her. He was a fool, a desperate, pathetic fool who had grabbed onto a lifeline that turned out to be a venomous snake, and it was now dragging them both down into the depths. He slid down the grimy wall, pulling Mia onto his lap and wrapping her tightly in his arms, trying to shield her with his own body heat. But he felt as cold and empty as the building around them. The last embers of hope had been snuffed out by the cold, damp reality of this place. There was no escape. They had no money to go back, and nowhere to go back to. They were stranded at the edge of the world in a collapsing wreck, with only the howling wind for company. He felt the crushing weight of his failure settle over him, a physical burden that made it hard to breathe. He looked up at a jagged hole in the roof, at the cold, distant stars staring down at them with absolute indifference. Tears of pure, undiluted despair began to stream down his face, freezing on his cheeks. He had reached the bottom before, but this was different. This was a new, deeper level of hell, a place so devoid of hope that he could feel it sucking the very soul out of him. He buried his face in Mia's hair, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. The journey, the letter, the flicker of false hope, it had all been a cruel joke played by a merciless universe. He felt a profound, soul-crushing foolishness. He had been so desperate for a miracle that he had ignored all the signs, bartered their last few dollars for a ticket to this desolate prison. The isolation was no longer a feeling. It was a fact, as solid and unyielding as the frozen ground beneath them. The wind howled through the broken structure, and it sounded like laughter, a cold, mocking sound that echoed the emptiness inside his own chest. He had thought he had nothing left to lose back in the city. He was wrong. He had just lost the last, most precious thing he had, the illusion that things could ever get better. Here, in the rusted-out heart of Serra Fria, surrounded by decay and the ghosts of dead industry, Leo finally understood. He hadn't just reached the bottom. He had started digging. Dawn broke not with light, but with a slow dilution of the darkness. The grey twilight that filtered through the holes in the roof revealed the full extent of their tomb. Frost coated every metal surface, glittering cruelly in the faint light. Leo felt the cold in his marrow, a deep, cellular chill that his own shivering could not dislodge. Mia was curled into a tight ball on his lap, her breath shallow and ragged in the freezing air. He felt a surge of pure, primal terror. He had to get her warm. He had to make a fire. The thought was an anchor in the swirling chaos of his despair, a single, actionable task. He gently shifted Mia, wrapping her in his own thin jacket and propping her against a less damp section of the wall. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with a quiet, trusting fear that broke his heart all over again. He had to do something. He had to fight. For her, the weight of her gaze was the only fuel he had left, a tiny spark against the overwhelming cold. He had to try, even if it was just to postpone the inevitable. He scanned the vast, cluttered space, his mechanic's eye automatically assessing the debris. He needed dry wood, something that would burn hot and fast. He spotted the pile of collapsed pallets in the far corner, a mound of rotting wood. Most of it was damp and useless, but perhaps the wood at the very bottom, shielded from the dripping roof, might be salvageable. He began to move, his body stiff and aching, every joint protesting. His first task was to clear a space on the dirt floor, away from the walls and any flammable debris. He started dragging a heavy, overturned workbench, the metal legs screeching in protest against the concrete chunks on the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence, an ugly, grating noise that felt like a violation of the workshop's grim peace. He worked with a grim, focused energy, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The physical labor was a relief, a way to channel the frantic, useless energy of his fear into something tangible, something that might just keep his daughter alive for another few hours. The work was slow and exhausting. Every piece of rusted metal he moved felt impossibly heavy. He uncovered layers of forgotten industry, hardened gears, tangled coils of copper wire, and strange, specialized tools whose purpose was lost to time. It was a graveyard of ambition. As he cleared a space near the back wall, he began to notice the wind more acutely. It wasn't just the mournful howl that had tormented them all night. Here, in this corner, it was different. It was a focused, high-pitched whistle, a constant stream of air that seemed to emanate from a specific point on the wall. He paused, wiping sweat and grime from his brow with the back of his hand, and listened. The sound was coming from a large, circular opening covered by a rusted metal grate, an old ventilation shaft. It was this draft that was making this corner of the workshop feel 10 degrees colder than the rest. He made a mental note to block it off somehow once he got a fire going, to stop it from sucking all the precious heat away. He continued clearing the debris, tossing aside splintered planks and shattered machine parts. His hands, though calloused, were soon raw and bleeding, the cold making every small cut feel like a deep gash. Mia hadn't moved. She was just watching him, her small face pale, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. She looked so small, so lost in the cavernous, threatening space. He tried to give her a reassuring smile, but it felt like a grimace, a lie his face refused to tell. He turned back to his work, the rhythmic clang and scrape of metal on concrete becoming his mantra. Clear a space, find dry wood, make a fire, survive. The simple, brutal litany was all his mind could handle. He worked until his arms burned and his back screamed in protest, driven by the image of Mia's wheezing breaths. He was a machine fueled by desperation, his body a tool to be used until it broke. The air he was breathing was thick with the dust of decades, and each lungful felt like inhaling ghosts and rust. Finally, he had a small, clear patch of dirt floor. He turned his attention to the pile of rotten pallets, using a length of rebar as a lever to pry the damp, heavy layers apart. The wood on top was spongy and dark with mold, falling apart in his hands. It smelled of decay and wet earth, but as he dug deeper, the wood became lighter, drier. He found a half-dozen planks that were still solid, shielded from the worst of the leaks. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He felt a tiny, fragile flicker of triumph. He had a space. He had fuel. He carried the planks back to the cleared area, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. As he set the wood down, the whistling from the ventilation shaft seemed to change. The wind gusted outside, and for a moment, the high-pitched sound modulated, dropping in tone to a low, rhythmic hum before returning to its piercing whistle. It was a strange, almost musical effect. He dismissed it as a trick of the wind and his own exhausted mind, and knelt to arrange the wood. "Daddy." Mia's voice was a tiny whisper, so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the wind. He turned. She had crept closer, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the rusted grate of the ventilation shaft. "Daddy," she said again, her voice a little stronger, filled with a strange sense of wonder. "That sound, it sounds like a song." Leo frowned, listening. It was just a whistle, the random noise of wind passing through a metal tube. "It's just the wind, sweetie," he said gently, his voice hoarse. Mia shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No," she insisted, taking a small step closer to the wall. "Listen, it's like the song Mommy used to hum, the one she hummed when she was working on her computer with her headphones on." The words hit Leo with the force of a physical blow. A cold shock went through him, completely independent of the room's temperature. Clara's humming. It was a sound he hadn't thought of in a year, but now it came rushing back with painful clarity. A low, tuneless, repetitive melody she would hum when she was deep in concentration. He stood up slowly, his body forgotten. He walked over to where Mia was standing and listened. He closed his eyes, blocking out the sight of the decay around them, and focused only on the sound. It was a high, thin whistle, yes, but underneath it, or perhaps woven through it, was something else, a rhythmic pattern, a sequence of notes. It was impossibly faint, a ghost of a melody riding on the breath of the wind, and it was familiar. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. It was like her song, the same cadence, the same odd little three-note drop at the end of the phrase. It was insane. It was impossible. A coincidence. A hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. But Mia had heard it too. His logical mind, the mind of a mechanic who understood physics and airflow, screamed that it was impossible. But the heart of a grieving husband, desperate for any sign, any connection, was screaming louder. He felt the hair on his arms stand on end. The workshop was no longer just a ruin, it was a place holding a question. He placed his hand on the rusted grate of the vent. It was ice cold, the metal vibrating faintly with the passage of the air. The sound seemed to emanate directly from it, a siren's song from a metallic throat. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of disbelief. How? How could the wind randomly create a specific, personal melody? It made no sense. It was a cruel trick of acoustics, a freak of nature amplified by his own desperate longing. But the connection, once made, was impossible to sever. Clara, her song, here. In this forgotten place owned by a relative he never knew. The pieces didn't fit. They were from completely different puzzles. Yet here they were, laid out before him on the grimy floor of this collapsing workshop. The need for a fire, the biting cold, the hunger, it all receded, pushed aside by a new, far more powerful force, a burning, obsessive need to understand. He felt a forgotten sensation course through him. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something sharper, more dangerous, raw, unadulterated curiosity. He had to know where the sound was coming from. He had to follow it. His eyes traced the path of the ventilation system. The wide, rusted ductwork ran from the grate up to the ceiling, then snaked its way across the vast, open space, suspended by heavy-duty brackets. It looked ancient, a part of the workshop's original anatomy. It ran the full length of the main room before disappearing through a large, rectangular hole in the concrete floor on the far side of the building. A cellar, of course. The main duct would lead to a furnace or a central air unit in a basement level. He felt a knot of dread and excitement tighten in his stomach. The thought of descending into a dark, unknown space beneath this wreck was terrifying, but the pull of the melody, the impossible ghost of his wife's presence, was stronger. He had to see. He had to know. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from his toolbox, one of the few things that still worked, and its beam cut a solid, reassuring cone through the dusty air. Mia watched him, her eyes wide. "Are you going to find the song, Daddy?" she asked. He knelt in front of her, his hand trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm just going to look at something," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You stay right here where I can see you, okay? Don't move." She nodded, clutching her bear. The trust in her eyes was a physical weight. He walked towards the gaping hole in the floor, the beam of his flashlight dancing ahead of him, illuminating a set of steep, rickety-looking wooden stairs that descended into absolute blackness. The air that rose from the opening was even colder and damper than in the main room, carrying a heavy, cloying smell of stagnant water and deep, undisturbed earth. It smelled like a grave. He felt a tremor of fear run down his spine, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn back, to build the fire, to focus on survival. But Clara's song was in his head now, an insistent, looping mystery he couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath and started down the stairs. Each step groaned in protest under his weight, the wood soft and spongy with rot. He kept one hand on the damp stone wall for balance, the flashlight held out like a sword in the other. The beam revealed a small, square cellar, its walls made of rough-hewn stone. The ductwork continued down here, a massive metal artery running along the low ceiling, and the sound was louder, much louder. The melody was clearer, less a whisper, and more a distinct, hummed tune. It was undeniably Clara's song. His heart was a drum against his ribs. The floor was a mix of packed earth and slick, muddy patches where water had pooled. In the center of the room, the ductwork made a sharp 90-degree turn, plunging directly towards the foundation wall before terminating abruptly. This was the source, the end of the line. The sound was pouring out of the sealed end of the tube, the metal resonating like a giant, primitive flute. There was no furnace, no machine. The duct just stopped. It was an acoustic dead end. He ran his hand over the wall where the duct terminated. Cold, damp stone. He tapped it with his knuckles. Solid. He moved the beam of his flashlight over the surrounding area. The foundation was old, made of large, irregular fieldstones held together with crumbling mortar, but the section directly behind the duct's end was different. His breath caught in his throat. It was a crudely patched section, a rough square about a meter wide. The bricks were newer, more uniform than the surrounding stone, and the mortar was a different color, laid on thick and sloppy by an amateur hand. It was a patch, a cover-up. Something had been sealed away behind this wall. The humming melody seemed to be leaking through the cracks in the mortar, a secret whispering for release. He felt a jolt of adrenaline so powerful it made him feel lightheaded. This was it. This was something real. This wasn't a trick of the wind. It was engineered, deliberate. He pressed his ear to the bricks, and the humming vibrated directly into his skull. He scrambled back up the rotten stairs, his mind racing. He needed a tool, something strong, something to break through. He rummaged frantically through his large mechanic's toolbox, his hands shaking so much he could barely grasp the cold steel. He found what he was looking for, a long, heavy-duty pry bar designed for popping stubborn ball joints. It was nearly a meter long, solid, forged steel. It felt heavy and powerful in his hands, a tool of deconstruction. He took a moment to check on Mia. She was exactly where he'd left her, a small, still figure in the vast, dark space. "I'm okay, sweetie," he called out, his voice echoing strangely. "Just a little more." He didn't wait for a reply. He was a man possessed. He descended back into the cellar, the pry bar feeling like an extension of his own desperate will. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances. He was an actor, a force, about to smash through the wall of his own helplessness. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a wild, almost feral excitement. He jammed the chisel end of the pry bar into a crack in the crude mortar. He put his shoulder into it and heaved. For a moment, nothing happened. The wall was solid. He repositioned the bar, found a better angle, and threw his entire weight against it. A loud crack echoed in the small cellar, and a chunk of mortar fell to the dirt floor. A puff of dry, stale air escaped from the new opening, carrying a scent of dust and old paper. The humming melody from within grew louder, clearer. He worked with a feverish intensity, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold. He jammed the bar in again and again, grunting with the effort, the sounds of his labor a violent counterpoint to the soft, ghostly tune. Bricks began to loosen, then fall, smashing onto the packed earth below. He was tearing open a secret that had been sealed for who knows how long, driven by the impossible sound of his dead wife's favorite tune. It was madness, and it was the most sane he had felt in a year. Soon the hole was big enough to see through. He shone his flashlight into the darkness beyond. It wasn't a cave or a tunnel. It was a room, a small, man-made chamber, completely dry and clean. The sight was so incongruous, so impossible within the context of the surrounding decay, that he just stared for a full minute, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It was a deliberate, hidden space, a panic room, a vault. He tore out the last few bricks, his hands raw and bleeding, not even feeling the pain. The opening was now large enough to crawl through. He swung his legs over the rubble and dropped into the hidden chamber, his feet landing softly on a clean concrete floor. The air inside was still and dry, a stark contrast to the damp chill of the cellar. The humming melody was gone. In the confines of the small room, he realized the sound had been an illusion, created by wind flowing over a complex series of baffles and reeds hidden inside the final section of the ductwork, an ingenious, purely mechanical audio signal. He swept the flashlight beam around the small, windowless room. It was stark and utilitarian. Along one wall was a simple, sturdy workbench, and on the bench sat the source of the mystery. It wasn't a treasure chest of gold or a bag of money. It was a series of custom-made metal cases, like something designed for military equipment. There were 5 of them, each one sealed with a heavy-duty locking mechanism. They were sleek, professional, and utterly out of place. They radiated a sense of importance, of secrets deliberately and carefully protected. Beside them, a small, portable cassette player sat covered in a light film of dust, as if waiting. A cold dread mixed with his excitement. This was more complex than a hidden inheritance. This was something else entirely. He felt like he had stumbled into the middle of a story he didn't understand, a story that had been waiting in the dark for a new reader. And the first chapter was locked inside these impenetrable metal boxes. He had to get them open. He chose the smallest of the cases and carried it back out into the main cellar, setting it on the dirt floor. The lock was not a standard padlock. It was a complex-looking combination lock with no obvious way to bypass it. Frustration warred with his adrenaline. He had come this far. He refused to be stopped by a lock. He was a mechanic. He understood mechanisms. But this was beyond his expertise. In a fit of desperate rage, he lifted the heavy pry bar high over his head and brought it down with all his strength directly on the locking mechanism. The sound of metal striking metal was an explosive bang that echoed through the cellar like a gunshot. A dent appeared, but the lock held. He struck it again and again, a primal scream of frustration tearing from his throat with each blow. On the fourth strike, there was a sharp crack and the shriek of tortured metal. The lock had broken. His hands were shaking violently as he pried the lid of the case open. He shone his flashlight inside. His heart sank. Not money, not jewels. The case was packed tight with audio cassette tapes. Dozens of them. Each one was neatly labeled, not with words, but with a complex system of codes and dates. Underneath the tapes were several thick, leather-bound journals, their pages filled from cover to cover with a dense, tight script, also in some kind of code. He felt a wave of crushing disappointment. What was this? It was worthless. Just a bunch of old tapes and scribbled notebooks. All that effort, all that impossible hope for this. He slumped against the cold stone wall, the pry bar clattering from his numb fingers. He had been a fool, chasing a ghost song to a box of useless junk. His eyes fell on the cassette player sitting on the workbench in the hidden room. It was a long shot. The batteries would be dead, but he had to know. He crawled back into the hidden room and grabbed the small machine. It felt impossibly light, a cheap piece of plastic holding a world of potential disappointment. He returned to the cellar and sat on the cold floor, the open case before him. He fumbled with the back of the cassette player. To his astonishment, the battery compartment was clean, the contacts free of corrosion. It was as if it had been stored for him. He grabbed a tape at random from the case. The label read TR7B Final. It meant nothing to him. His fingers felt thick and clumsy as he pushed open the plastic door of the player and slotted the cassette inside. He took a deep breath, the cold, earthy smell of the cellar filling his lungs. This was it, the answer to the impossible melody. He pressed the play button. There was a faint whirring sound as the ancient spools began to turn, followed by the soft hiss of blank tape. His heart sank again. It was nothing, just silence. He was about to press stop, to give up, to finally succumb to the crushing weight of his foolishness. And then a sound, a click, and a voice that shattered his world and rebuilt it in a single, breathtaking second. It was Clara's voice. It wasn't a recording of her humming. It wasn't a memory or a ghost. It was her, speaking, clear, crisp, and filled with a steely determination he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Log entry, October 12th, she said, her voice sharp and professional, devoid of emotion. Subject name Valdemar Rocha. Operation Sarah Freer is compromised. They know I'm a journalist. The informant is dead. My cover is blown. I am initiating the Phoenix Protocol. This is not a disappearance. It is a tactical retreat. Leo, if you are hearing this, I am alive. I am so sorry. Follow the trail. The evidence is everything. Leo dropped the cassette player. It clattered onto the dirt floor, but the voice continued, a clear, living testament from the small plastic speaker. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. A tidal wave of emotion so massive it threatened to drown him, crashed over him. Shock, disbelief, ecstatic relief, and a profound, bone-deep confusion. Clara was alive. She wasn't dead. She hadn't left him. She was a journalist, an investigative journalist. The sound of his wife's voice, alive and defiant, echoed in the small, dark cellar. It was the single most impossible, beautiful sound he had ever heard. The despair that had been his constant companion for a year evaporated in an instant, replaced by a white-hot energy that coursed through his veins. He felt like he had been defibrillated, his heart shocked back into a frantic, powerful rhythm. He looked at the metal cases, at the coded journals, and the dozens of tapes. They weren't worthless junk. They were a message, a breadcrumb trail left by his wife. This wasn't an inheritance of property, it was an inheritance of purpose. The workshop wasn't a ruin, it was a base of operations. The ghost song in the wind wasn't a haunting, it was a key, a brilliantly engineered signal designed to be understood only by him and his daughter. 1,000 questions exploded in his mind at once. A journalist, a human trafficking ring, a man named Rosha. What in God's name had his wife been involved in? He was no longer a victim. He was a player in a game he didn't understand, and his wife had just dealt him in. He picked up the tape player, his hands still trembling, and rewound the tape. He listened to her message again, and then a third time, the words burning themselves into his memory. I am alive. I am so sorry. Follow the trail. The evidence is everything. He felt a surge of love and admiration for her so fierce, it brought tears to his eyes. The cleverness, the bravery, the foresight to create this entire elaborate system, the song, the hidden room, the evidence. She had trusted him. She had trusted that if the worst happened, he would find this, that he would be smart enough, or perhaps just desperate enough, to follow the clues. He looked at the journals, at the coded script. It was a language he didn't speak, a map he couldn't read, but Clara had left it for him. She believed he could figure it out. For the first time in a year, he felt the crushing weight on his chest begin to lift. The future was no longer a black, empty void. It was a mystery, and he had just been given the first clue. He was a mechanic, a man who fixed broken things, and he would fix this. He carefully gathered the journals and the first case of tapes. He had to protect them. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever his wife had uncovered, it was dangerous enough for her to stage her own disappearance. It was dangerous enough for her to build this fortress of secrets. The people she was investigating weren't just criminals, they were powerful. Powerful enough to make a person vanish. He looked around the damp cellar, at the broken wall and the scattered bricks. He had just announced his presence. He had just kicked the hornet's nest. He didn't know who the enemy was, or where they were, but he knew they existed. He was no longer just a grieving father trying to survive. He was the guardian of Clara's life's work. He was the keeper of her evidence. A sudden, cold fear pierced through his elation. He wasn't alone in this workshop. He had Mia, and he had just dragged his daughter into the middle of a war he knew nothing about. He had to be smart. He had to be careful. He had to finish what Clara started. He scrambled out of the cellar, the heavy metal case clutched to his chest like a holy relic. The main workshop was still dark and cold, but it looked different now. It was no longer a symbol of his failure, but a place of incredible significance. It was Clara's secret headquarters. He looked over at Mia, who had fallen into a light, uneasy sleep against the wall. He felt a fresh wave of terror and resolve. He had to protect her, but he also had to honor the incredible risk Clara had taken. He couldn't just run. He couldn't ignore this. His wife was alive, and she was counting on him. He found a deep, empty storage locker in the corner of the shop, one that was relatively dry and had a working lock. He carefully placed the metal case and the journals inside, concealing them beneath a pile of greasy rags and old machine parts. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do for now. He had to decipher the journals. He had to listen to the tapes. He had to understand the full scope of the danger they were in. The mystery was just beginning. He finally went back to the pile of dry wood he had gathered what felt like a lifetime ago. He arranged it carefully in the cleared space and, using a lighter from his pocket, set it ablaze. The small flame flickered, caught, and grew into a small, cheerful fire. The warmth began to push back against the oppressive cold, the light dancing on the rusted hulks of the machinery, making them seem less menacing. He gently woke Mia and brought her close to the fire, wrapping the blanket around her. She coughed, but her shivering began to subside as the heat soaked into her small body. She leaned against him, her eyes fixed on the flames. Leo stared into the fire, his mind a whirlwind. He had come to Serafria seeking a roof over their heads, a desperate escape from poverty. He had found something infinitely more complicated and dangerous. He had found a mission. He had found a path back to his wife. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this small fire was not just for warmth. It was a beacon in the darkness, and it was about to attract attention. The workshop was no longer silent. It was filled with the crackle of the fire and, in his mind, the echo of Clara's voice. The wind still howled outside, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a warning. Leo held his daughter close, the weight of the secrets he now carried settling upon him. The grief he had carried for a year was gone, replaced by a volatile mixture of fear and fierce determination. He was a man with a purpose, and that made him dangerous. He didn't know who Valdemar Rocha was, or what the Phoenix Protocol entailed. He didn't know what horrors were recorded on the dozens of tapes locked in the metal cases, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His wife had trusted him to be the one to unearth the truth. He looked at Mia's face, illuminated by the firelight, and he made a silent vow. He would not fail. He would follow the trail, no matter how dark the path became. He would find the truth. He would finish what Clara started, and he would bring her home. The night in Serafria was far from over. A new, more dangerous day was dawning. For 2 days, the workshop became a sanctuary of frantic purpose. While Mia slept near the warmth of the constantly fed fire, Leo worked. He sat on the cold floor, the journals and a notepad spread before him, his breath pluming in the air. The code was a fortress, a complex substitution cipher that resisted all his logical attempts to break it. He felt a gnawing frustration, a race against a clock he couldn't see. Each gust of wind outside sounded like approaching footsteps, and the sense of being watched was a physical pressure on the back of his neck. The scent of wood smoke and old metal filled the air, the backdrop to his desperate search. His hands, stained with grease and now ink, trembled with a mixture of cold and adrenaline. He knew the answers were in his hands, but they were locked in a language he couldn't understand, and the weight of that ignorance was crushing. He turned his attention back to the tapes, hoping Clara had left a verbal key. He carefully examined the coded labels, searching for a pattern: TR7B, C04A, Index 01. His heart leapt at the last one. Index. He fumbled to put the cassette into the player, the plastic shell feeling fragile and ancient. He pressed play, and the familiar hiss filled the silence. He listened with an intensity that bordered on prayer, his entire being focused on the faint sounds coming from the small speaker. He fast-forwarded through long stretches of silence, his thumb aching on the button. He heard clicks, static, the distant sound of a passing car, but not her voice. Despair began to creep back in, cold and familiar. He had been so sure. The hope that had ignited in the cellar began to feel like another cruel hallucination, a phantom light in an endless dark. Just as he was about to give up, her voice broke through the static, not the professional reporter's tone, but the warm, slightly teasing voice he remembered so vividly. "Leo, my stubborn mechanic," she began, and the sound of her saying his name sent a shockwave through him, blurring his vision with sudden tears. "If you're hearing this, you were clever enough to find my hideout. Or maybe Mia just heard my song. Now, for the hard part. The code. Remember that old Norton Commando we spent a summer rebuilding? The one you said had more soul than any new machine? The key is in the service manual. Page number, line number, first letter. It's all there, my love. Be careful. This is bigger than us." A wave of love and awe washed over him. The Norton, it was their project, their secret language. The brilliant, beautiful mind of his wife reached out to him from the past, trusting him, guiding him. The decryption was a slow, agonizing process. He didn't have the manual, but he had spent so many hours with it that he had entire sections memorized. He closed his eyes and pictured the diagrams, the columns of torque specifications. Page 42, line 7, CEE for clutch E. Page 11, line 3, HE4 headlamp. The first words began to emerge from the gibberish, letters forming into a horror story. Victim Alpha, name, Elena, age, 19, snatched from bus station, promised work as a waitress. His stomach coiled into a tight, sick knot. He wasn't just reading a journalist's notes. He was reading an obituary, a catalogue of stolen souls. Each letter he painstakingly translated felt like an act of bearing witness, a sacred duty to a life that had been violently erased. The cold in the room felt different now, imbued with the chill of the grave. He found the corresponding interview tape, labeled VA01, and pressed play. This time, he was prepared. A young woman's voice, thin and trembling, filled the workshop. She spoke in hesitant Portuguese, punctuated by ragged, terrified sobs. "They put us in the back of a truck," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the tape's hiss. It was dark. I couldn't breathe. The smell. It was the smell of fear. Leo felt the bile rise in his throat. He could feel the darkness of that truck, hear the muffled cries. Clara's calm, steady voice would interject occasionally, asking a gentle question, guiding the testimony. He was listening to his wife walk through hell, her only weapons a tape recorder and her own unbreakable courage. He felt a surge of pride so fierce it was painful, mingled with a terror that left him breathless. The translated journal entries were even more devastating. They were a cold, factual account of a modern-day slave trade. Clara had used her cover as a freelance geologist to get close to the region's mining operations. She described the illegal coltan mines hidden in the folds of the Serra Fria Mountains, places that didn't appear on any map. She wrote of men and women, many of them desperate migrants, forced to work 18-hour days in unsafe pits, digging for the rare mineral with their bare hands. She wrote of meager rations, of brutal guards, of the casual disregard for human life. The words were precise, clinical, but beneath them, Leo could feel her barely suppressed rage, a fury that burned off the page. He felt sick. The phone in his pocket, the electronics in his car. He suddenly saw them in a new, horrific light, tainted by the blood and suffering described in his wife's handwriting. A profound shift occurred within him, a change so fundamental it felt geological. The search for Clara had been a personal quest, a journey through his own grief. This was different. This was a war. He now understood her Phoenix protocol. It wasn't just about her survival. It was about the evidence. She had sacrificed her life with him and Mia, had plunged herself into a living death to protect these tapes and journals. She had become a ghost to ensure these other, real ghosts, the victims of the mines, would one day have their stories told. The weight of his own despair seemed small and selfish in the face of her sacrifice. He was no longer just a father protecting his child. He was a soldier who had just been handed the battle plans from a fallen commander, a commander who, by some miracle, was still alive. His purpose was no longer just survival. It was justice. And one name was at the center of it all, a black hole of gravity pulling all this misery into its orbit, Valdemar Rocha. Clara's research was meticulous. She had compiled a complete dossier. On paper, Rocha was a regional hero, the CEO of Rocha Agro Solutions, a massive agricultural export company. He was a philanthropist, a political donor, his smiling face a regular feature in the society pages, often pictured shaking hands with governors and senators. He was the man who had supposedly revitalized Serra Fria's economy. The hypocrisy was so vast, so monstrous, it was almost incomprehensible. This celebrated captain of industry was a slave trader, a monster hiding in plain sight, shielded by his wealth and public image. Leo felt a cold, hard hatred solidify in his chest, a feeling so pure and intense it burned. Clara had connected the dots with terrifying clarity. Rocha Agro Solutions was the perfect front. Its fleet of refrigerated trucks, which carried produce to ports hundreds of miles away, was the transport mechanism for the trafficking ring. Clara's notes detailed shipping manifests she had acquired, cross-referencing them with fuel logs and GPS data from a source inside the company. The trucks would deliver their legitimate cargo, and on the return trip, they would stop at designated points, bus stations, migrant shelters, where Rocha's men would round up new recruits. The victims would be loaded into hidden compartments, transported back to Serra Fria, and forced into the mines. The operation was seamless, integrated, and protected at every level. Rocha hadn't just built a company. He had built an empire of human misery, a perfectly efficient machine for turning people into profit. The sound was so alien, it took a moment for Leo's brain to process it. It was the low, confident hum of a powerful or well-tuned engine, a sound of wealth and modernity that had no place in this forgotten town. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding against his ribs. and peered through a crack in the rusted metal wall. A sleek, black luxury sedan, so clean it seemed to repel the town's decay, was gliding to a halt in front of the workshop. The sunlight glinted off its polished chrome, a painful, blinding flash. He felt a jolt of pure animal fear. They knew. Somehow, they knew he was here. He instinctively grabbed a heavy iron pipe. His knuckles turning white, he glanced at Mia, who was still asleep by the fire, blissfully unaware. He felt a savage, protective instinct rise in him. He would die before he let anyone touch her. A man stepped out of the car. He wasn't a hulking thug. He was something far more unnerving. He was tall, unnaturally thin, and wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He moved with a reptilian grace, his polished shoes finding a clean path through the debris-strewn dirt as if by magic. His face was a mask of cold professionalism, his eyes scanning the dilapidated workshop with a look of detached amusement. He radiated an aura of effortless power and absolute contempt. This was not a man who used his fists. He was a man who whispered orders that made other people use theirs. He stopped 10 feet from the entrance. His presence an affront to the workshop's history of honest labor, a stain of expensive cologne on the air of rust and damp earth. He was the physical embodiment of the soulless corporation described in Clara's journals. Mr. Leo Rossi. The man's voice was smooth, cultured, and devoid of any warmth. It slid through the cold air and seemed to coat everything it touched with a layer of frost. "My name is Dr. Almeida. I am a legal representative for Mr. Valdemar Rocha." He gestured vaguely at the collapsing structure. "My client has a certain historical interest in this area. He has been consolidating properties and has instructed me to make you a substantial offer for this parcel. He is prepared to be extremely generous to avoid any protracted negotiations." The lawyer's eyes flickered around the squalid interior, taking in the makeshift fire, the single suitcase, the general despair of the place. His expression didn't change, but Leo felt stripped bare, his poverty and desperation inventoried and assessed in a single, cold glance. Dr. Almeida named a figure. The number floated in the space between them, a string of zeros that seemed to bend reality. It was an impossible sum, a king's ransom. It was enough money to disappear, to buy a beautiful new house in a place where the air was clean, a place where Mia would never wheeze for breath again. He could afford the best doctors, the best schools, a lifetime of security. All he had to do was say yes. Say yes. And this entire nightmare would be over. The weight of Clara's mission, the faces of the victims, the terror of Rocha. It could all be left behind, buried in this rusted tomb. The temptation was a physical force, a sweet, poisonous warmth spreading through his chest, promising release from a burden he never asked to carry. For one dizzying second, he saw the escape route, a golden bridge leading away from this hell. The whisper of the man on the tape, describing the darkness of the truck, echoed in his ears. He saw Clara's handwriting, neat and furious, detailing the horrors of the mines. This wasn't money, it was a payoff. It was the price of his silence, paid for with the lives of countless others. He met Dr. Almeida's cold, expectant gaze. "The property is not for sale," Leo said. His voice was steadier than he expected, anchored by a resolve he didn't know he possessed. A flicker of annoyance crossed the lawyer's face, a crack in the polished veneer. "That is an unwise decision, Mr. Rossi," Almeida said, his voice losing its smoothness, taking on a harder edge. "Mr. Rocha is accustomed to getting what he wants. This is a very dangerous building, structurally unsound. I imagine the authorities would condemn it in a heartbeat. Terrible accidents have a way of happening in old places like this." The lawyer's gaze then deliberately shifted, moving past Leo to the small fire. He saw Mia, now awake, watching them with wide, fearful eyes, clutching her teddy bear. The lawyer's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, a predatory baring of teeth. His voice dropped, becoming a soft, conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "Especially," he purred, the sound dripping with menace, "when there's a child involved. It would be a genuine tragedy to see a little girl get hurt because her father was being foolishly sentimental." The threat, no longer veiled, hung in the air like a physical poison. He gave a curt, dismissive nod and turned, walking back to his silent, waiting car. Leo was left standing in the sudden, deafening silence, his body rigid with a terror so profound it felt like he was encased in ice. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was here. It was now. What would you do in his place? Would you take the blood money and run, securing your child's safety but sacrificing justice? Or would you stay and fight an invisible, all-powerful enemy, knowing that every moment could be your last? The lawyer's black sedan disappeared, but the silence it left behind was more terrifying than any noise. The threat lingered in the air, a toxic residue that clung to every surface. Leo's heart was a wild bird trapped in his ribs, beating itself raw against his bones. He stared at the empty space where the car had been, his mind replaying Almeida's words, the soft, venomous promise of an accident. He felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the workshop's temperature. It was the icy touch of true, calculated evil. He looked at Mia, her small face pale with a fear she didn't understand, and the lawyer's reptilian smile flashed in his mind. The threat wasn't against him. It was against her. The primal, protective rage that surged through him was so potent it made him dizzy. He was no longer just a man trying to solve a mystery. He was a father protecting his cub from a predator he now knew was circling, and he felt a terrifying certainty that the predator would be back soon. His first instinct was to barricade the door. He dragged a heavy, rusted engine block in front of the main entrance, the metal groaning against the dirt floor. It was a pathetic, futile gesture against the kind of power Rocha represented. But the physical act calmed his frantic nerves, just slightly. He was a mechanic, a man who built and fixed things, and the act of building a defense, however weak, was the only language he had to fight the encroaching panic. He returned to the small fire, but its warmth now felt like a liability, its light a beacon announcing their position to the entire valley. The smoke curling up through the holes in the roof was a signal fire, telling the monster exactly where to find them. He had thought this workshop was a secret. He was wrong. It was a target. Every creak of the old metal structure, every gust of wind, now sounded like an approaching footstep. The isolation he had once lamented now felt like being trapped in a cage with no one to hear him scream. He knew they couldn't stay, not another night. The promise of an accident was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. But where could they go? They were penniless, stranded. His mind raced, sifting through the impossible options, running into the mountains on foot. They wouldn't last a day, trying to hitchhike on the main road. They would be too exposed, an easy target for Rocha's network. The town itself was a collection of empty houses and shuttered windows. But the bus driver had mentioned a general store, the only one still operating. It was a sliver of a chance, a single point of potential contact with the outside world. He needed food, water, and batteries for the cassette player. But more than that, he needed information. He needed an ally. He looked at the heavy case containing Clara's work. He couldn't leave it, but he couldn't carry it all. He had to make a choice. He had to distill years of his wife's dangerous work into a package small enough to carry while running for his life. The decision was agony. He opened the main case, the dozens of tapes and journals a silent testament to the lives ruined by Rocha's greed. Which stories were the most damning? Which voices cried out the loudest for justice? He chose the first journal he had decrypted, the one containing the core of Clara's investigation into Rocha Agro Solutions. He then selected a handful of cassette tapes, the interview with Elena, the terrified girl from the bus station, a recording of a whistleblower from inside Rocha's company, and a tape labeled Logistics Primary Route, which he guessed contained the transport details. He wrapped them in an old oilcloth and stuffed them into a small, worn rucksack. The bag felt impossibly heavy, not with physical weight, but with the burden of the lives it represented. He felt like he was curating a museum of suffering, choosing which tragedies to save from the fire. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach, a cold nausea of impossible responsibility. He gently woke Mia, forcing a smile that felt like a painful crack in the frozen mask of his face. "Hey, sweetie," he whispered, his voice strained. "We're going to go for a little walk. We need to buy some food from the town store." She looked at him, her eyes still wide with the memory of the strange, suited man. She didn't question him, just nodded and reached for his hand, her trust a sharp, painful jab to his heart. He was lying to her, leading her out of one danger and directly into an unknown one. He slung the rucksack over his shoulder, took one last look at the workshop, Clara's sanctuary, their temporary tomb, and pushed aside the makeshift barricade. Stepping outside into the fading afternoon light felt like stepping onto a stage. He felt exposed, naked, his every move watched by 1,000 unseen eyes from the dark windows of the dead town. The wind whistled down the empty street, carrying the scent of rain and a palpable sense of menace. The walk to the town square was an exercise in controlled terror. Every crunch of their feet on the gravel seemed to echo for miles. Leo kept Mia on the side away from the street, his body a shield against a threat that could come from any direction. The 10-minute walk from the bus stop had felt like an eternity before. Now, it was a gauntlet. The shuttered houses seemed to lean in, their peeling paint like leering faces. A loose shutter banged rhythmically in the wind, sounding like a slow, mocking clap. He scanned every alley, every dark doorway, his hand gripping the strap of the rucksack so tightly his knuckles were white. He was acutely aware of Mia's small, wheezing breaths beside him, a fragile counterpoint to the pounding of his own blood in his ears. He wasn't just walking to a store, he was moving a target through hostile territory, and the weight of that knowledge was a physical pressure threatening to crush him. Finally, he saw it. Across the cracked concrete of the town square stood a single building with light in its windows, a simple wooden sign. Its paint faded but still legible, read Afonso's Emporium, Provisions and Necessities. A faint, warm yellow light spilled from its large front window, an impossible island of life in an ocean of decay. As they approached, the sound of a small bell jingling above the door was the most welcoming sound Leo had ever heard. He pushed the door open, and a wave of warmth and complex smells washed over them. It smelled of freshly ground coffee, dry goods in burlap sacks, old paper and a faint, pleasant aroma of pipe tobacco. The contrast with the cold metallic dampness of the workshop was so profound it was disorienting. The store was a time capsule, with goods stacked high on wooden shelves that reached the pressed tin ceiling, a place of order and quiet persistence against the town's slow death. Behind a long wooden counter stood an old man, carefully polishing a pair of glasses with a soft cloth. He was small and wiry, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, but his eyes, when he looked up, were startlingly bright and kind behind the thick lenses. He had a full head of snow-white hair and hands gnarled with arthritis, but he moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He watched them enter, his gaze taking in Leo's disheveled state, Mia's pale face, and the desperate tension in Leo's posture. He offered a small, gentle smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Boa tarde," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones rolling in a slow river. "Not many new faces in Serra Fria these days. What can I do for you?" The man's calm demeanor was a balm on Leo's frayed nerves. For the first time since arriving, he felt he could take a full, deep breath without fear of it being his last. Leo tried to act normal, to project an air of casual need rather than frantic desperation. He asked for bottled water, canned beans, crackers, and a pack of D-cell batteries. As the old man, Afonso, gathered the items, his movements were unhurried, methodical. He placed each item on the counter with a soft thud, his perceptive eyes occasionally flickering towards Leo. "You're staying in the old Rossi workshop, aren't you?" Afonso asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Heard the bus drop someone off the other night. Artur was my oldest friend." Leo felt a jolt. This was it, a connection. "He was my great-uncle," Leo replied, his voice hoarse. I inherited the place." Afonso nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Leo's face. "I can see the resemblance," he said softly. "You have his eyes, determined and troubled." Artur had troubled eyes too, especially in the old days. Leo hesitated, the lawyer's threat echoing in his mind. But the kindness in this old man's face felt genuine, a lifeline in a sea of hostility. He had to take the chance. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I had a visitor today," he said, the words catching in his throat. a lawyer. He said he worked for a man named Valdemar Rocha. The change in Afonso was instantaneous and terrifying. The gentle kindness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a hard, cold fury that seemed to emanate from a deep, ancient well of anger. His wrinkled hand, which had been resting on the counter, clenched into a tight, white-knuckled fist. The friendly shopkeeper was gone, and in his place was a soldier. "The devil," Afonso whispered, the words a curse spat from his lips. He looked past Leo, towards the front window, his eyes scanning the empty square. "Not here," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "Come. To the back, now." Afonso lifted a section of the counter and led them through a beaded curtain into a small, cluttered back room. It was a personal space, filled with sagging armchairs, stacks of old books, and walls covered in faded black and white photographs. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and history. Afonso bolted the door behind them, the sound of the heavy deadbolt sliding home a reassuring thud. He turned to Leo, his face grim, the kindness replaced by a fierce intensity. "You are in more danger than you can possibly imagine," he stated, not as a warning, but as a simple, terrible fact. "Tell me everything. What do you know? What did Artur leave you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Leo felt the last of his defenses crumble. He was out of his depth, drowning, and this old man was the only person who seemed to understand the currents that were pulling him under. Leo's story tumbled out, a torrent of grief, confusion, and fear. He told Afonso about Clara's disappearance, the letter, the ruin of the workshop, and the impossible song in the wind. He described the hidden room, the tapes, and the coded journals. As he spoke, Afonso listened without interruption, his weathered face a mask of profound concentration. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding, as if Leo were merely filling in the details of a story he already knew. When Leo finished, the silence in the small room was thick and heavy, charged with the weight of the revelations. Afonso closed his eyes for a long moment, as if in prayer or mourning. When he opened them, they were filled with a grim resolve. "Artur was not a simple locksmith," he began, his voice low and steady, imbued with the gravity of a confession. "That was his cover. He was a master of secrets." Afonso walked over to a wall of photographs. He pointed to a picture of a much younger man with the same determined eyes as Leo, standing with a group of other young men and women, their faces filled with defiant hope. "During the dictatorship," Afonso explained, "Artur was one of us, a member of the resistance, but he wasn't a fighter, not with guns. He was an artist. His medium was steel and wood and concrete. He built hiding places, secret rooms, escape tunnels, false walls. He was a genius, a creator of safe havens for people hunted by the regime. The workshop was his laboratory, his masterpiece. He saved dozens of lives with his cleverness. That building isn't a wreck. Son, it's a fortress, if you know how to read it. He built it to protect ghosts." The words hung in the air, reframing everything Leo had seen. The ruin wasn't a sign of failure, it was a shield, designed to be overlooked, underestimated. "After the regime fell, Artur stayed here," Afonso continued, his gaze distant. "He said the ghosts of this town needed a guardian. When your wife came here, she found him. I don't know how. She was a journalist, asking questions about Rocha, dangerous questions. Artur saw the same fire in her that he'd seen in the old days, the same courage. He knew she was walking into the lion's den." Afonso's voice cracked with emotion. He let her use the workshop. He knew it was the only place safe enough for her work. "He told me, not long before he died, that he was helping a brave woman build a case against the devil who owned this valley. He said she was in terrible danger, that Rocha's evil ran deeper than anyone knew. He worried for her constantly, and then, one day she was gone. Artur believed she had escaped, that she had initiated a plan he helped her devise." Afonso turned back to Leo, his eyes locking onto his with an urgent intensity. Artur was a pessimist. He always had a contingency plan, and a contingency for the contingency. He knew there was a chance Clara wouldn't make it out, or that her evidence would be lost. "He told me that if anything happened, and if someone came looking for her work, someone with his blood in their veins. I was to give them the final key. The old man's words were a lightning strike, illuminating the path forward. A final key. A plan laid out years ago by a man he never knew, a silent promise passed down through blood and friendship. Hope, real and powerful, surged through Leo's chest, a warmth that chased away the cold dread. He wasn't alone. He was part of a legacy of resistance, a chain of courage stretching from the past into this terrifying present. The weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter, shared now with the ghosts of brave men and women. "Back at the workshop," Afonso said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There is a small bookshelf near the old forge. Arthur didn't read much, but he kept a few books from his activist days. Find the one with the blue cover. It's a collection of poems by Ferreira Goulart. The title is Poema Sujo. Inside the spine, sealed in wax, is a small piece of paper. It holds the private telephone number of a federal prosecutor in Brasilia. His name is Matias Lacerda. Arthur saved his life back in the 70s, got him out of the country when the death squads were looking for him. He owes Arthur a debt that can never be fully repaid. He is the one man in this country who has the power to fight Rocha and who cannot be bought. This is your only move, Leo. You must call him. It is Clara's only chance. It is your only chance." The journey back to the workshop was a blur of adrenaline and purpose. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows that clawed at the edges of the street. The wind had picked up, howling with a new urgency. Afonso had insisted on keeping Mia at the store, promising to protect her with his life. "Go," he had said, pressing an old, heavy shotgun into Leo's hands. "Get the number, then come back. You are not safe there." The weight of the gun was unfamiliar and terrifying, a cold, hard piece of reality. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was an armed man moving through enemy territory on a critical mission. The workshop, when he reached it, loomed in the twilight. No longer a tomb, but a complex machine of secrets he was just beginning to understand. He slipped inside, the familiar smell of rust and damp earth, now mixed with the scent of a brewing storm. He found the bookshelf, just as Afonso had described. It was a small, dusty set of shelves holding fewer than a dozen volumes. His hands trembled as he scanned the spines, and there it was, a thin book with a faded blue cover. Poema Sujo. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. He ran his thumb along the spine and felt it, a slight, unnatural thickness. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle, the key to unleashing the truth Clara had died, and lived, to protect. He was about to tear it open when a sound from outside froze him in place. It wasn't the sleek purr of a luxury car. It was the low, guttural rumble of a heavy-duty truck, its engine straining as it pulled to a stop directly in front of the workshop. The sound was brutal, aggressive, a declaration of war. A blinding glare of high-beam headlights flooded the workshop, slicing through the darkness and pinning Leo like a cornered animal. The light bleached all color from the room, turning the hulking machines into monstrous, skeletal silhouettes. He dropped to the floor, his heart seizing in his chest. He heard the truck doors slam shut, 2 of them. Heavy, booted footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. There was a low murmur of male voices, rough and impatient. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a threat. This was the consequence. The accident had arrived, right on schedule. The book felt impossibly fragile in his hand, a flimsy shield of paper and poetry against the brute force gathering outside. His mind raced, a chaotic jumble of fear for Mia, the weight of Clara's evidence, and Afonso's grim-faced warnings. He was trapped. Then came the sound that shattered the night, a loud, metallic shriek as a crowbar was jammed into the frame of the main door, followed by a splintering crack as the rusted metal began to give way. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were a wrecking crew, sent to demolish him and everything he had discovered. There was no time to think, only to act. He scrambled backward on all fours, away from the terrifying light and the sounds of destruction. The plan he had been forming, get the number, return to Afonso's, was instantly obsolete. He was in a fight for his life. The shotgun Afonso had given him was leaning against the wall, but he knew it was a fool's hope. 2 of them, likely armed, against him. It was a death sentence. He had to run. He had to use the fortress Arthur had built. He had to disappear. He grabbed the rucksack containing the precious tapes and journal, his only thought to protect the evidence. The book with the prosecutor's number was still clutched in his other hand. The main door groaned, metal tearing as the thugs put their weight into it. He didn't hesitate. He ran, not toward the back of the workshop, but toward the center, toward the gaping hole that led to the cellar. It was his only way out. He half slid, half fell down the rickety wooden stairs, landing hard on the damp earth of the cellar below. The sounds from above were louder now. A final, deafening crash as the main door gave way, followed by the heavy, thudding footsteps of the men storming into the workshop. He could hear them shouting, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. "Find him! Rocha wants it all burned!" Leo's flashlight beam cut a frantic path through the cellar's darkness. Searching. Afonso had said Artur built escape routes. If there was one, it would be here, in the heart of the secret construction. His light fell upon a section of the floor in the far corner, under a low-hanging pipe, a cluster of what looked like heavy iron ring pulls, flush with the packed earth floor, almost invisible in the gloom. An escape hatch, another of Artur's ingenious creations. He lunged for it, his fingers fumbling with the cold, rusted metal. He pulled with all his might. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't budge. He heard the thugs above him begin to smash things, the sounds of destruction echoing through the floorboards. He gave another desperate, adrenaline-fueled heave. With a groaning scrape of earth and stone, a heavy trapdoor lifted, revealing a square of absolute, bottomless blackness. The smell that rose from the opening was ancient and foul, the scent of sewage and stagnant water, an old storm drain. Just as the sound of footsteps started down the cellar stairs, Leo swung his legs into the hole. He dropped into the darkness, landing with a splash in a foot of icy, foul-smelling water. It was pitch black, the air thick and suffocating. Above him, he saw the flashlight beams of the thugs cutting through the cellar, heard their surprised curses as they discovered the open, hidden room. He didn't wait. He turned and plunged into the tunnel, away from the faint square of light from the hatch. He was running blind, one hand on the slimy brick wall to guide him, the other clutching the rucksack and the book. The sounds of the workshop and his pursuers faded behind him, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breaths and the sloshing of his feet in the dark, filthy water escaping into the bowels of the earth. He burst out of a storm grate in a back alley behind the town square, gasping for air that tasted clean and sweet after the suffocating stench of the tunnel. He was covered in filth, shivering uncontrollably from the icy water. But he was alive. The rucksack was still on his back, and the book was still clutched in his hand, its paper now damp and warped. He stumbled through the darkness, drawn to the single point of light in the town, the warm, yellow glow from Afonso's emporium. He burst through the door, the bell above it jingling frantically. Afonso was waiting, the heavy shotgun resting on the counter. The old man's face was a mask of grim anxiety that melted into profound relief when he saw Leo. Leo didn't say a word. He staggered to the counter and collapsed onto a stool, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion and terror. He simply laid the damp, precious book on the counter between them. Afonso picked it up gently, as if it were a sacred text, his gnarled fingers tracing the title. He nodded slowly, his kind eyes filled with a fierce, terrible light. The time for waiting was over. In the small, cluttered back room, the air was thick with tension. Afonso carefully dried the book's pages by the heat of a small kerosene lamp, his movements slow and reverent. With a small, sharp knife, he slit the binding and extracted a tiny, wax-sealed packet. Inside was a single, folded piece of paper with a telephone number scrawled in Arthur's familiar hand. Afonso pushed his old rotary phone across the table. Leo's hand trembled as he picked up the heavy receiver, the plastic cool against his ear. He dialed the long string of numbers, each click of the rotary dial sounding like a hammer blow in the silent room. It rang once, twice, a third time. He was about to lose hope when a man answered, his voice sharp and impatient. "Lacerda." Leo's throat was dry. "My name is Leo Rossi," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Artur Rossi was my great-uncle. He told me to call you if—" The prosecutor cut him off. "Artur is dead." The voice was cold, dismissive. I know, Leo pressed on, desperation making him bold. But he left me something. Evidence. About Valdemar Rocha and the mines. There was a dead silence on the line. Then Lassiter's voice returned, transformed. It was low, dangerous, and utterly focused. Don't move. Don't speak to anyone. I'm sending a team. Tell me where you are. 2 days later, Leo sat on a park bench in a bustling, anonymous city 2 hours away from Serra Fria. Afonso had driven him there in his ancient pickup truck under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, Mia sleeping safely in the back of the store, watched over by a network of old-timers Afonso had summoned. The instructions from Lacerda had been precise. Be at this bench at noon. Wear a blue shirt. Wait. The sounds of the city, traffic, laughter, music, were a jarring contrast to the silence of the last week. Every passing stranger looked like a threat. He clutched the rucksack on his lap, the weight of its contents a constant, physical pressure. At exactly 12:05, a man and a woman sat on the bench opposite him, pretending to read newspapers. They looked like school teachers. After a full minute of silence, the man folded his paper. The air is cold in the mountains, he said, the words a question. But the fire burns hot, Leo replied, his heart pounding. The woman stood up, walked over, and simply took the rucksack from his lap. She opened it, pulled out a small cassette player and one of the tapes. She listened for 30 seconds, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded to the man. We have it, she said. Go back to the store. Do not leave. We will be in touch. The dawn raid was not a sound Leo heard, but one he felt. A low, deep vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of Afonso's store. It was the sound of rotors, dozens of them, a swarm of angry hornets descending on the valley. From the small attic window, Leo and Afonso watched as 3 large, unmarked helicopters, black against the grey morning sky, landed with military precision in the fields surrounding Rocha Agro Solutions. A fleet of armoured vehicles, which had been hiding in the surrounding hills, converged on the corporate headquarters from all sides. There were no sirens, only the muffled sounds of tactical commands shouted over radios, the splintering of doors and the shattering of glass. It was a swift, brutal and silent invasion. It was the sound of a secret, powerful arm of the government reaching into the darkness and tearing a monster out by its roots. The empire of suffering that Rocha had built in the shadows was being dismantled in a matter of minutes by a force that was just as silent and far more powerful than his own. The news came via a small, crackling television in Afonso's back room. A special report interrupted the morning cartoons. There he was, Valdemar Rocha, the philanthropist, the man of the year. He was being led from his sprawling modernist mansion in handcuffs. His expensive silk pajamas were rumpled, his face a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The mask of civility had been ripped away, revealing the snarling predator beneath. He shouted at the reporters, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine, protesting his innocence, but his eyes were wild with the terror of a cornered animal who knows the hunt is over. The federal agents surrounding him were impassive, their faces grim as they pushed him into the back of an armored car. Leo watched the screen, his body numb. He felt no triumph, no joy, only a profound, hollowed-out sense of relief. The weight that had been crushing him for a year had finally, impossibly, been lifted. The monster was in a cage. The world felt a little brighter, the air a little easier to breathe. The days that followed were a blur of official proceedings in a secure government building. The story Leo told, corroborated by Clara's meticulous evidence, became the backbone of the largest human trafficking prosecution in the country's history. The liberated workers from the mines, now safe in federal protection, confirmed every horrific detail. The scandal toppled politicians and exposed a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. One afternoon, Prosecutor Lacerda, a man whose weary eyes held the weight of 1,000 such horrors, sat down across from Leo. Your wife was an exceptionally brave woman. Mr. Rossi, he said, her work will save countless lives. He paused, looking at a file. We have dismantled the entire network. There are no more threats. And because of that, we were able to bring in our final witness. He gestured to a door behind Leo. She's been in protective custody in another country for 11 months. She is waiting for you. Leo's heart stopped. He stood up slowly and turned, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He walked to the door and opened it. She was standing by a window, looking out at the city, her back to him. She was thinner, and there were strands of grey in her hair that hadn't been there before. But it was her. It was Clara. The sound of the door opening made her turn. Her eyes, those same bright, intelligent eyes, widened in shock. For a full second, neither of them moved, trapped in a moment of impossible reunion. The silence was broken by a tiny gasp from the doorway. Mia, who had been holding Leo's hand, let go and took a hesitant step into the room. "Mommy," she whispered, the word a fragile prayer. That single word broke the spell. A sob tore from Clara's throat, and she ran, stumbling, across the room. She didn't go to Leo first. She fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around Mia, burying her face in her daughter's hair, her body shaking with a year of pent-up grief and love. Leo knelt and put his arms around both of them, the three of them becoming a single, weeping, breathing entity. He could feel her heart beating against his. She was real. She was warm. She was home. Leo never went back to the workshop. It was seized as part of a federal crime scene. The government, as part of its victim and witness compensation program, awarded them a sum of money from Rocha's confiscated assets that was so large it seemed like a clerical error. It was a fortune built on blood and suffering, now repurposed to build a new life of healing and peace. They left the city, left the mountains, left behind all the ghosts and dark memories. They bought a house on the coast, a simple, beautiful home with large windows that let in the clean, salt-tinged air from the ocean. It was a place where no one knew their story, where they were just another family. Leo started a small, specialized garage, working on vintage cars not because he had to, but because he loved the feel of a well-made machine. He found solace in the logic of engines, in the simple, honest work of making broken things whole again. It was a quiet life, a precious, fragile thing they guarded fiercely. 6 months after Rocha's conviction, a typical Tuesday felt like a miracle. The rhythmic, gentle hum of Clara's new sewing machine drifted from a sun-filled room where she was making curtains. She had taken up writing again, not searing exposés, but fiction, stories of hope and resilience. The smell of baking bread filled the small house, a warm, comforting scent that had replaced the permanent odors of mold and decay. Outside, in the green, manicured backyard, Leo pushed Mia on a swing he had built himself. Her laughter, loud and clear and free of any wheezing, was the most beautiful sound in the world. Her asthma, soothed by the clean sea air and the best medical care, was now just a managed condition, not a constant, life-threatening crisis. He looked at his daughter, her face alight with pure joy, and at the window of his house, where he could see the silhouette of his wife. He felt a profound sense of peace settle deep into his bones. He was no longer a ghost haunted by the past, but a man firmly planted in a bright, hopeful present. The battle was over. The scars, both visible and invisible, would always remain, a quiet reminder of the darkness they had walked through. But they were healing, together. The love that had guided Clara to build a fortress of secrets, that had driven Leo to decipher a ghost's song, and that had brought their family back from the dead, was the foundation of their new life. It was a testament to the fact that even when faced with unimaginable evil, the bonds of family and the courage to fight for what is right can become an unbreakable shield. They had not just survived, they had been redeemed by their refusal to surrender. The story of their journey through despair and back into the light serves as proof that one person's determination can change the world. What injustices in your own world have you refused to accept? If you are inspired by stories of ordinary people who find extraordinary courage, subscribe to our channel and become part of a community that believes in fighting for the light, no matter how deep the shadows.